So welcome to this little video. I wanted to talk about um, process as far as painting goes. And I actually filmed something that was really quick, and it's part of my blog post, and you can find the link to my blog post in the description box below. And it was just I think, too quick. And I really wanted to be able to give you something that you can refer back to time and again. So I'm going to use a really simple example, and I'm going to walk you through how I would create a more finished type of painting. And it doesn't even have to be a huge painting, just something that requires a little bit more planning. And I find that the more planning that you do when you're painting, usually the more successful and the fresher the painting is, because you already have picked out your color palette, you understand what you're doing for a composition, and there's really not a whole lot that's left to chance. This is also a really good method if you're new to painting, and you can follow the steps that I use, and after you paint for a while, you'll be able to develop your own process. So I have a sketchbook here and a pencil. I have this little watercolor block. This is by Paul Rubens, and I bought this because it's really cute and pink. This is 140-pound hot press paper. And the difference between hot press and cold press is the texture. There is no texture on this, and hot press is a little less forgiving than cold press, and we'll see what happens when we start our painting on this paper. But I like this because it's 100% cotton. So I've got that. I have my watercolors, and I also have my iPad here, and I'm looking at some images of some mushrooms, and this particular mushroom is one that we've all seen in our, fairy tales. I'm going to turn this light off so you can see and there's no glare. This is called a fly agaric, and it is poisonous, but it's also really pretty. And I thought this would be a fun subject for us to paint because, as you can see, it has all of these white warts on it and some white areas. And if you're new to painting, especially in watercolor, white can be a little bit tricky, but I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks about saving the white of your paper and what happens if you don't. So this is what we'll be working with. And if you read my blog post, you'll see that I usually start off with just an idea and sketching an idea with a few thumbnail sketches. And since I have this paper that is rectangular in format, I can set up my thumbnail sketches either vertically or horizontally and see what I like better. And I can already tell you right now that because the mushrooms are vertical, that I'm probably going to use the vertical format. I don't think that this horizontal format's going to serve me as well as I would like it to. I'm sure that if I played around with this for a while, I could probably come up with something. Maybe I could add in a little butterfly or something there. And actually, that wouldn't be too bad. But I like the idea of this vertical format. And what I was actually thinking was creating something like this. And I'm just sketching in some rough ideas. I actually thought about having a few little branches here with some leaves on it and maybe some pieces of grass, something to frame out the mushroom. And I don't know if I'll be adding in one or two mushrooms at the bottom. I could always add an insect of some sort on the top too for some more interest. Here's another idea that would be kind of cool. We could sketch in our mushroom. Like this, and I always feel like it needs something at the bottom to kind of anchor it, but maybe we could echo the shape of the paper and just create a border here. And I've been working in my nature journal, so I think I would actually want to make that smaller. And this is why we do thumbnail sketches, so we can work out the ideas that we have. So this would be kind of cool to do a border and then do some lettering down here. And the only thing about adding just one subject to a composition is that it's kind of boring and the eye really doesn't have anywhere to go. So I would probably add in those other mushrooms, and maybe we could take this one outside the border here. Maybe not quite that far. But just something to add a little more interest. That might be kind of cute. And then we can just do some little blades of grass. So I think I like this idea the best. And what I'll do now is sketch this out even bigger. Because when we're working from thumbnail sketches, the idea is just to get the ideas onto a piece of paper. Once you've figured out what you want to do, then it's time to move on to sketching. And you can do this in a number of different ways. You can work with your pencil on a piece of paper, or you can work on your iPad in a program called Procreate. And this program can be really valuable as far as creating line drawings. And this was the last watercolor painting I did for my blog post all about violets, and you can watch the speed painting. I'll put the link below for this, but this is a line drawing that I created in my iPad and I printed it out. And the reason that I do it this way is that it's quicker for me, and it also saves paper, and I can do this outside if I want, and I don't have to worry about dragging all of my supplies downstairs. So this is another method you could use. I would take this and export it as a JPEG, save it to my photos, bring it up on my desktop, open it, print it. I would make sure that it was the proper size. I would start off with the proper size in this so that when I took the piece of paper and brought it over to my watercolor paper to transfer it, it would be the correct size. So I think for this purpose and this demonstration, I'm going to stick to using a pencil and paper because not everybody has an iPad, and we're going to just stick to the old school way. But please know that those methods are there, and maybe in some future videos we'll get more into the digital aspect. If you guys are really interested, drop some comments below and let me know if that's something that you'd like to learn too. So let's go ahead and start our sketch. And the reason we're doing it this way is that we're trying to save our paper. With watercolor paper, if I start drawing on here, which you can do, especially if you're using more inexpensive watercolor paper and you want to sketch directly on it, that's fine. But for this demonstration, we're actually talking about creating a more final piece, something that's been more planned. So I like to keep my paper as clean as I can until I transfer the drawing, and it prevents erasing, and it prevents extra lines being put on the paper, and it prevents damage actually to the paper. So that's how we're going to approach this. We're going to approach this as if this were a big piece that we were working on, and we're doing it just in a smaller, scaled down kind of a version. So I'm actually going to trace this just to give myself a little bit of a guideline. And I can do it like this so that I have the actual size of my paper. And I could measure this out and annotate it on my paper, but I'm not going to do that because that was a lot easier. So this is the space that I'll be working in, and now I can start sketching. And something else before I get sketching, you know, tear out your sheet of paper with your thumbnail sketch on it so that you can refer back, so you know what you're doing, and use your reference images to work from, so that you have a solid photo or something to go from. Do not ever copy other people's work, or make sure that you use photos that are royalty free, that are free to use, that aren't copyrighted. If you go to unsplash.com, there are a whole library of images that you can use, and if you do use one of those, it's always good to credit the artist too. So all right, I'm just going to kind of do this free form, not really drawing off of a reference photo, and so let's start sketching. Okay, so now we're going to take our tracing paper, and once we get our sketch the way that we want it, lay our tracing paper over the top, and you can use a straight edge for those lines if you'd like. Just so that things are a little bit more accurate. And I don't mind if the lines go over, because when I transfer this onto the watercolor paper, I'll know if I don't want the lines to overlap, not to overlap them. And if I do like that look, then I can leave it. So that might be an option. And this may not be the lettering that I use either. I might so I'm basically just going to use this as kind of the placeholder, I guess, for the lettering. Now I can go over my mushroom shape and trace everything that I like about it and nothing that I don't. And when we transfer this onto our watercolor paper, you're really looking for the most basic shapes that you'll be transferring. I don't typically add in a ton of details at this point because usually if you transfer those on, you'll paint over those lines anyway with your watercolor. So it's really not super necessary. I do like to make indications of where things live. And we'll be doing that with the little dots that are on top of the cap, so that we don't paint over those because we want to keep those white. This process is really good to use, especially if you're painting people and you want to have a nice clean drawing on your watercolor paper before you start adding your layers and details and that kind of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and add in some grass. And I'm just drawing in loosely some indications of grass blades. And the reason I'd like to put this at the bottom, it's a good way to anchor whatever it is that you're drawing. And be sure to add some variety to it. You do not want the same shape going across the page. So now I'm going to add in these shapes. And I'm kind of looking, and I want to see if there's really any rhyme or reason or any pattern to these. And they're actually warts, so they're raised off of the top of the mushroom. And you can be as realistic or as unrealistic as you want, because this is your painting. So you can totally do whatever it is that you want to do. And we'll be leaving these warts white, and then after we do that, we'll go back in and we're going to tint them a little bit and add a little bit of shading because they are raised off the surface of the mushroom. So we won't leave them completely white. And I'm going to show you a couple of different methods to save the white of your paper with watercolor, and we're going to use masking fluid, which we'll do on this top one, and we're going to paint around the white areas on this one, and this one we're not even going to worry about it. We'll do it after the fact, and I'll show you how to do that. So you can pick whichever method works best for you, or you can use a combination of these methods in your paintings. Completely up to you. Now for me, I don't like to paint hyper realistic. I am of the mindset that if I wanted to look at something painting that's that realistic, then I would just look at a photograph. I like to see somebody's creativity and their style come through in their painting. That's what makes it unique. I like to see somebody else's take. So I'll add these in there. And in my blog post, I have posted a little link. Actually, it's not a little link, it's a little video. It's a little video about composition. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's really good. And you can grab the basic idea of composition and layout from that video, which is something you'll be working out when you're actually doing your thumbnail sketches. So this is my basic line drawing, and this is the drawing now that I'm going to take, and I'm going to put this on my watercolor paper. And because I traced the size, I knew the boundaries. You can, like I said, I think this is 5 by 7. So I could have measured it out, but it was just quicker and easier to kind of trace around it. So what I would do from here is I would tape this down, and I think I'm going to actually grab a pair of scissors, sorry about my arm, and I'm going to cut this down just so that we don't have all of this overlap. Now you can see that I did a sketch, and I was able to lay this on top, and I have a final line drawing. Well, it may not, you may not be happy with this version, and you can always take another piece of tracing paper. Let's say that I wanted to tweak this and add in some sort of a detail or something. I can always add another piece of tracing paper onto the top and start adding in details on top of this. You don't necessarily have to redraw everything, but if you keep this sheet and you make some little registration marks on it so you know where to line it up, you can always take this after this is transferred and add it onto here. I don't think I'll be doing that, but just so you know, you can use as many many sheets of tracing paper as you need. And all of this can also be done digitally, like I said, which is really nice. And I'm going to grab a piece of tape. I have some washi tape here, and I'm going to line it up where I want it, and I'm going to tape it down. So I want to show you something before I tape this down. I have some transfer paper here, and this is what I use. And this is called Serral transfer paper. It comes in many colors. This is white. So if I were working on a dark piece of paper, I have white transfer paper, and I also have blue, and you can see all of the different colors that you can have and what it's for. So you can buy this on Amazon, and I will leave a link below in the description box and also in the original blog post if you want to check that out too. So I don't usually rip off new pieces, and I know that I have a little small piece of this floating around here which I can't seem to find, so I'm actually just going to cut this little piece off. Okay, so I have two options. I can either use this, or if I'd like I can use a piece of graphite pencil, and this is a really soft lead. I think this is a 6B. And I'm going to do one part of this just to show you. I don't typically do this method, but if you don't have transfer paper, it works. So I'm going to tape this down. Where I want it. And I'm going to grab my pencil, and you can use a pen too if you'd like. So I have a fine line ballpoint pen, and I also have a mechanical pencil, which is what I did my sketching with. So I'm going to show you how this transfers first. Always check. So that's transferring pretty good. You just have to be mindful when you're transferring your drawing onto your watercolor paper that you're not bearing down too hard. You'll leave indentations in the paper and then the paint pools, and we don't want that. That just makes life hard. And I'm going to switch back over to my pencil because it digs less. That ballpoint pen for me is just too sharp. Now I am going to put in where these little guys live, these little warts, because I'll be painting around those. Or actually, I think this is the one that we're going to add after the fact, so we don't have to put those in. So that's how that works with graphite on the back of the tracing paper. Now I'm going to show you the difference with this transfer paper, and this is the graphite kind, and there are two sides. There's the light side and there is a darker side. This is the dark side, this is the light side. The dark side is what goes face down, and I have spent a lot of time transferring my drawing to find out that I actually had it the wrong way. So you always want to check. So just slide that under there, and it's the same thing. You just go ahead and start transferring the drawing onto your watercolor paper. And we're going to do a quick check, make sure that it's transferring, and it is. So I'll tape that back down and finish this out. Okay, so we've got everything kind of cleaned up, and I know where everything's going, and I thought about adding in a little crescent moon up here in the corner, which means that I'm probably going to paint a dark sky. So I'm just going to kind of freehand this. And what I'll do is I'll leave this line drawing in the resources section of my website, so you can find this and print it out and use this if you would like, if you want to create the same painting. I encourage you though to sketch something out that you've always wanted to paint. It can be as simple or as complex as you'd like, and try this process. And I'm just lifting off some of that graphite because I don't need it to be that dark. And I'll probably end up either painting around this or masking it out. And at this point, I think I'm probably going to just paint around it. So now that I have everything here, and I'm going to lighten this little. It's pretty heavy with the graphite. You will be able to see these lines through your watercolor painting, so make sure that you have enough on there that you can see it and what you're doing and where you're going, and not so much that you see these dark lines coming through. Okay, something else that I want to talk about is where your light and dark will fall on the mushrooms. So if I have this moonlight up here, I have to kind of make a little bit of adjustments or kind of figure this out on my own without using a reference photo. I can just make some very small lines where I want the light to hit. And since we're talking about moonlight, it's not going to be super strong. Like I said, I'm not going for super realistic, but I am going to keep this part of the mushroom on the top lighter. So I'm just going to make a little annotation there for myself as a reminder. Will I paint over it? I don't know. Let's hope not. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. And maybe on this side, we'll keep this side a little bit lighter. I'm going to make a couple of annotations here too, that I want to keep that lighter. And maybe over here on this side. And if it's something that I forget, it's really not a big deal if I paint over it, because I can always go back in and fix those areas after the fact. A lot of people think that watercolor is incredibly unforgiving, and it's actually kind of right the opposite. You can work with it. So the next thing that I would do is think about how I want to approach this. And after you've painted with watercolors for a long time, you'll begin to develop your own process. So what I could do, if I wanted to keep this really simple and kind of illustrative, I could go in and just start with a wet layer of red with the local color and fill in the cap. And while it's wet or on its way to drying, I can go ahead and drop in some darker colors that will create a shadow and let that dry. And then at the end, I can add in details. Or I can start off with a very light layer of orange, because that's what I want to show through in the light areas. And I would let that dry and start in with a red color. Let that dry, add in my shadow color, let that dry. So it's really dependent on the kind of look that you're going for. And for this demonstration, I don't want to get too fussy about this. I want this to be something fun. So we're going to take more of like an illustrative approach to this. Okay, so now that we have all of this where we want it, we're going to go ahead and get started with our painting. I'm going to clean my mess up and come back with my watercolor paints. Just a quick note about this transfer paper, save it. I know I've used it one time, and you can see a little bit where the graphite is pulled off. You can use these sheets repeatedly, so save them. It'll save you some money too. So, all right, I'm going to get this cleaned up and I'll be right back. Okay, so I am back with my paints. I have a Schmincke watercolor set here that I'll be using, and I like this because I've got a variety of really nice warm reds here, and you can use whatever watercolors that you have on hand. I also have another set that I like to use a lot. It is my Daniel Smith set, and I just think I've got some better reds going on in here in this set, so I'm going to use this. I also have this Pebeo masking fluid marker, and they call it drawing gum, and it's got a nice little bullet tip on it, and it comes with an extra one in case this one gets nasty. And I don't know if you can see that really well. Let's see. And this is the type of marker that you have to prime the tip in order to get the fluid in there flowing, and it also has a ball in it so that you can shake this up, get everything mixed, and you pump the tip so that it will start flowing down into this bullet tip. Sometimes it takes a little while to get started, and I don't know if that's because it dries on the inside or what the deal is, but it requires just a little bit of patience. So now you can buy masking fluid in a jar as well and use a brush to apply it. You have to make sure that the brush that you're using is a brush that you don't mind getting junked up. In school, we were taught to put a little bit of liquid dish soap on the brush to act as a barrier between the bristles and the masking fluid, and that will help keep the brush lasting a little bit longer. They also make tools. They're like hard foam brushes that you can use to apply the masking fluid as well. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in these areas that we want to keep white. And these are irregular shapes, so it'll be pretty easy to use this marker for that. Keep a scrap piece of paper next to you so that you can prime the tip if you need to, if it's just not flowing the way that you want. And keep the tip clean. I'm not a huge fan of masking fluid, and the reason for that is that I don't really care for the hard edges that it creates. But it's kind of fun to experiment with it too. So there are a lot of great classes out there using masking fluid. So don't knock it until you try it. You may find that you do like it for certain applications. Okay, so with masking fluid, you can't really do anything until it dries. And do not use a blow dryer on your masking fluid. That's like a recipe for disaster. You want to be able to get it off after it's dried. So the best policy is to just let it dry on its own. This actually worked really well for this because these are really irregular shapes. If I was trying to do something a little bit more precise, I don't know if I would use this or if I would just paint around, or but I like it for this application. So we'll see what happens when we finish our painting and we pull this off. Okay, so we'll get our watercolor brush, and basically we're going to start painting the cap with water, and we're going to avoid all of the areas that we want to leave white. And since these are irregular white shapes, it's really pretty easy to do. Just make sure that when you're painting water that you don't have any areas that are pooling. You want a nice, even coat of water. And I'm tipping my paper this way so that I can see the sheen and I can tell if an area is wet or not. And I do have some areas that have a little bit more water in them, so I'm just going to kind of spread these out a little bit. And if there are some areas that we accidentally go over that we don't leave white, that's fine. We can fix that when we're finished. So I think that's pretty good. Now, since I have an annotation up here that I want to keep the top of this cap lighter than the rest, I'm going to start dropping in my paint on this bottom edge. And I'm going to go in with this this red. I'm not even sure where my palette card is for this palette. But it's a really, I would say, like a carmine or a scarlet red. And I'm just going to go ahead and start at this bottom edge here and start dropping in the paint. And the paint's only going to go where the water is. And I'm not going to paint, I'm going to stop at this line that I made where I want to keep it lighter. And what I'm really doing right now is I'm just kind of pushing the paint around into these wet areas, being careful to avoid the spots that I've left white. And I'm going to rinse out my brush so that it's damp, and I don't want all of that red paint on my brush. I want to just move the paint that's already on the paper up into this light area. And I can even dry my brush off a little bit and remove some of this paint up here. So this is not obviously completely dry because we just painted it. So while it's still damp, I can add in a darker red. And I would probably go ahead and add in a little bit of purple to this red. I'm going to make another puddle over here. And add in a little bit of this purple. Because I'm looking for a little bit of a shadow color that I can drop in over here while it's still wet. And this just helps to create a little bit of form. We're not going to get super involved with adding multiple layers to this. So this is a really easy way to do, to make something look realistic, even if you are just kind of doing a little illustration. And if you find that the paint's not moving the way that you want it to, you can always rinse off your brush, wipe it on the paper towel a little bit, and leave it damp, and kind of coax the paint where you want it. And I'm trying to avoid any really hard edges along this line. I want it to be a little bit blended, have kind of a soft look to it. So I can wet this edge a little bit so the paint won't dry as a hard edge here as well. And we'll just leave that to dry. Now, something else I can do, if I wanted to create a little bit more texture in this mushroom, I can rinse my brush off and pick up some water, and I can add little drops of water in here, and that'll give the mushroom even a more textured look. Now for this mushroom down here, the smallest one, we're not even going to worry about these little dots that we made. In fact, I'm going to probably just erase these. I'll lift these out with my kneaded eraser because we don't want those lines popping through. And I'll show you how we can put those on after all of this has dried. But I'm going to use the same process that I used to paint this cap, except this time we don't have to worry about painting around any white areas. We can just go ahead and paint the entire cap with clear water. And we can go right up to the edge. I did make a little note to keep this area over here light. I'm going to assume that this mushroom is underneath this cap, so this won't be getting any light over here. We'll just keep this edge light, the very edge. So I'll pick up a little bit of that same color, and I'm going to start over here on this side because I know that that side's going to be the darkest area. And I want this paint to bleed over here without my having to really do anything. So I'm just kind of helping it along on this edge. Okay, so I'm going to grab some more of this red that I added the purple into, and I'm going to drop that in anywhere that I think that it's going to be in shadow. And you can add as many layers to your watercolor painting as you want to. I'm just kind of cleaning up the shape here. And as you can see, I just dropped in that darker color in the area that I wanted to keep light. So I'm going to rinse and dry off my brush, and I'm going to pull that area out. And I'm going to clean up this little edge right here, and then we're going to let this dry. And I think before we go in with the details, I'm going to add in one little layer, one extra layer to kind of brighten everything up. So we're going to start on the cap of this mushroom, and I'm switching to a bigger brush, and I'm going to approach this the same way that I did the other two. So I'll wet this cap. And we'll start adding in the watercolor along the bottom edge. So I'm going to try to keep the top, this side, and right here a little bit lighter. And I'm tilting this so that I can tell where I've been with the water and how much water I actually have on the paper. And I don't want any areas to be pooling. So I can see the areas that I've missed or that have a lot of water on them. And I can just wipe my brush off and soak up the rest of this. So that looks like a pretty even coat. And I'm going to pick up a little bit more of this red. So we'll let this dry, and while that's drying, I'm going to go back to the caps on these mushrooms, and I'm going to kind of glaze a little bit of this bright warm red over the top, because I feel like once they dried, they're not as vibrant as I would like them to be. And we just have to be careful with this one because we painted around all of these white areas, and we don't want to lose those. So what I'll do is I'll get my smaller brush, and we're going to re-wet the area. But I really want to bump up the vibrancy. So I have some of this orange red I'm going to add into this mix, and this is really vibrant. And then I'm just going to drop it in, just like we did before. So I just took a little piece of paper towel and blotted that up. And I'm going to go back in and add a couple of little water drops for that added texture. And I'm going to do the same thing with this cap. And this was the one that we're going to add the light marks in afterwards. So this is just repainting. We don't have to worry about re-wetting anything. We can just work wet on dry. I'm going to rinse out my brush and wipe it off a little bit and kind of soften this area right here, because that was the light edge that we wanted to keep. So I'm going to use my paper towel to kind of just blot this area right here where we went out a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing with the texture. I'm going to add some little water drops in here, and I'm going to blot this up. So I'm going to approach the stems in the very same way that I did the caps. I'm going to wet the area. Making sure that I've got a pretty even coat of water. And sometimes you have to wait a couple of seconds, just let it kind of absorb into the paper. And I think I'll add some water to this one as well. And if you have to go back and re-wet, that's not a problem. If you're working in your studio, and especially if it's cold outside, you have heaters running or fans blowing, it will dry your paper out a lot quicker. And if you live in an area that's obviously high humidity, it takes a long time for it to dry. And I live in a very dry part of the country. It's not too bad right now, but in the wintertime when I have heaters going in my studio, then my paper dries really quick. So I have this really pretty light, kind of a Naples yellow. And that's what I'm going to just drop in. And remember, it will dry lighter. And I'm going to give this a few seconds before I start adding in any shading. We'll let that dry a little bit. And then I've got some brown here, and I'm probably going to add just a little bit of a dark blue, just to gray it down a little bit, and that will be the color that I use for the shadow, which I want to lay in right up here underneath the cap. And there's also this part of the, I feel like that's a little bit too wet still. There's the part of the stem that kind of flares out and adds a little bit of an extra layer. So I want to add a little bit of a shadow underneath that, just to define that. So I'll leave that alone and let that dry, and then I'll add a little bit of the same shadow on this one. So this large cap is pretty dry, and I think it's okay. We can go ahead and add another layer of this bright red. And I think what I'll do is I'll just glaze right over all of this. I'm not going to re-wet anything, because all I'm trying to do is brighten this up. Okay. Oops. So you can see that the stems have dried on this, and I want to push them just a little bit more. So what I'll do is go back into that shadow color, and I think I need to mix up a little bit more. So I'm going to grab some of this brown and a little bit of blue. I want it to be a warm gray. And I just am gonna, kind of strengthen these areas a little bit. And the same thing underneath this, just to add a little bit of definition. And if I wanted to, I could go down this side a little. The shadow edge right here, I want to blend out the edge a little. The other areas I'm fine with leaving. I feel like that's more of a cast shadow. So if the edges are hard, that's fine. And it helps to define these areas too. So And I'll do the same thing over here. I'm going to blend this out a little bit over here. Something else that you can do too, if you want to add a little bit of texture, you can always go in and add just some random dots. Something like that. There was a piece of fuzz in here that I didn't really like, and normally I would wait until the piece was dry. So I'm just going to go back in and add a little bit more paint where I pulled it out. And maybe a little bit more under here, just to define that. And I feel like that got a little bit too dark. There we go. So that just helps to create a little bit of form. Like I said, we're not going for anything super realistic. And we'll see how this is doing over here. And I think what I want to do is add another glaze to these because they're just not popping the way that I want them to. So I have this really bright yellow. I'm not sure. Like I said, I wish I had my palette card for this paint set. But it is a very warm yellow. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to glaze right over top of the red. And that'll help brighten it up a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Just very carefully painting around. I didn't re-wet any of this. This should give it a nice pop. And these mushrooms vary in color anyway. You'll find some that lean more towards the orange side. I'm going to drop in a little bit of red. And I'm going to tighten up this edge right here. There, and we'll let that dry. And I'll want to do the same thing over here. So I'm going to grab a larger brush. It's still a little bit damp, but that won't matter because we're just kind of glazing over top of this. And I'll probably drop in a little bit of red. And I'm going to rinse my brush out. I'm going to dry it off a little bit, and I'm going to pull a little bit of that out up at the top. I don't want to lose my light areas. So just clean that edge up like that. And I think I'm going to add some drops of water in here as well. Just for that texture effect. You can add salt too. That's always really kind of a cool texture look. And I need to clean up this edge over here. And I'm just wetting my brush and kind of very gently scrubbing. And then I'll grab my little piece of paper towel and blot it up. And you don't want to scrub too hard. You don't want to take the chance of, you know, damaging your paper. But you can fix mistakes in watercolor. It's not impossible. So these are pretty dry, and I'm going to go ahead and glaze over that really pale yellow. Sorry about that train. And it's picking up a little bit of the red. It's kind of bleeding into it because I'm re-wetting. And that's okay. You can just take your brush and lift out that red. So I'll wait until that dries before I try going in and adding any sort of little shadows within those white dots. But this is pretty dry. I think it's dry enough that I can go ahead and start on this. So I'm just wetting this. And I'm going to keep most of the color along this back edge and let it bleed. And some colors will spread better than others, so sometimes you just have to help the paint along. And I'm trying to stay away from the edge of this mushroom because I don't want any of the red to bleed into my stem. And that looks pretty good, I think. Okay. So we're going to pick up that same yellow and just start dropping it in. I'm going to take that same shadow color, and now that these should be dry, I'm just going to add a little bit. I'm not overdoing it. This is just a really light, watered down shadow color, I should say. And I'm just making a couple of indications. Just to give, the effect that, they're actually raised. Now, as I'm waiting for this stem to dry, I'm looking at this and I'm deciding whether or not I want to mask out this moon. And I think actually it would make it a lot easier to paint the background if we masked that out. And I can always go back in and soften the edge if I feel like I need to. So I'm going to get out this masking marker again. I'm going to try to shake this away from the microphone. And we'll have to prime this tip again. And let's see how this is. Okay. I think that's pretty good. Now we can very carefully go in here and start filling this moon in. And this has to dry before we can add in any of the blue for the background. And this is actually, I'm finding that this marker, I'm liking this a lot better than having to use a brush. And I'm going to add in some of that shadow color on this stem now. So I can define these areas a little bit more. I'm going to blend this edge out. I'm going to add some drops of water in here too, just to give it a little bit more of a textured look. And I'll do the same thing over here. And we'll blend this edge out. think I'm going to lift some of this out here. There. I think I want to lift a little bit of this out along here. Just to redefine that edge a little bit. And maybe right up here on the top. I'm going to pull a little bit of this paint out. Okay, so I can go ahead now and start adding in some of the grass areas, and I'm not going to be too precise when it comes to this area. We'll drop in some paint and then we'll pull these blades up. So what I'll do is lighten all of this graphite here. I don't need those to be so dark, especially if we don't follow those exactly. So I'm going to pick up some of the yellow that I glazed with, which is this really warm yellow. And I'm going to pick up a dark, like indigo blue. I want this to be kind of a dark cool green. And at this point I'm just kind of deciding if that's the direction I want to go, or if I just want to start laying in. I think I'm just going to start laying in some water here. And we'll drop in some of our dark greens. And you can see I've got a little bit of paint on my brush still, which is fine. And I'm letting this kind of bleed down in between the letters a little bit. I do know that I don't want a really hard edge. So I'm just dropping this in, and I'm going over the base of these mushrooms. So that we can anchor them to the ground a little bit. I'm going to drop in some other colors here. I'm going to grab a little bit of that indigo and drop some of that in. And then I'm going to grab some yellow. Now this is a cool yellow. And this is where I'm going to start pulling up some of these blades of grass. And I don't want them to be too fine because I know that I have to go back in here with that sky color. So I don't want this to be super fussy looking, but we can save these really fine pieces of grass like that for around the base of the mushroom because we know we don't have to worry about painting around them. But this area I'm going to try to make more of a shape that's easy to paint around. And I'm just grabbing some yellow and using the tip of my brush to pull these blades of grass up. There, I like that. That won't be too difficult to paint around. And we have some nice variation in color. And we can soften some of these edges in here to go down in between the lettering. I'm just dropping a little bit more paint in here so I can get this to bleed a little bit. Okay, there, I think that's good. And I think we might be okay to take this masking fluid off. Although because I have some that are running up along the edge of this mushroom, I think I'm going to wait and take this off until after we paint in the sky, which means we have to wait for this masking fluid to dry. So this masking fluid is dry, and I think we're pretty good to go ahead and start painting the background on this. So I'm not going to go super dark. I just want to go dark enough, obviously, that this reads correctly as a moon. And I'm going to mix up a couple of colors that I really like. I have like I know Winsor & Newton makes a color called smalt, I believe, and this is what this kind of blue, kind of an violet color. It's a really blue purple. And I might add a little bit of indigo to that. And I think the way that I'm going to approach this is I'd like to get a fairly even wash through here. So I think I'm just going to create a really watery puddle here. And I'm going to work, I'll just wet on dry. And I've got a little bit of damage here to my paper. So we'll see what happens with that. Hopefully it's not too bad. I'm going to go as close up to the edge here as I can, and I'm going to spin this around as I need. And the idea is when you're painting a wash like this, you have this pooling here, and you can see here's the damage on the paper. So we'll have to somehow camouflage that. So I'm pushing this paint puddle around, and I want the edge to stay wet. I don't want it to dry this hard edge. So you do have to work a little quick with this if you don't want your edges to dry. And you can work in sections. That makes it a little bit easier so you don't feel like you're rushing through. And turn your paper around. That helps a lot. And I'm going to have to mix a little bit more paint up here. And I think I grabbed a little bit too much dark blue, so let's see how this color matches up here. I'm going to add a little bit more of this purple in there. And I'm trying to be as precise as I can be. And I just went over that part of the mushroom a little bit. And now I'm going to move to this section. And if you work in small sections like this, these enclosed sections, it's a lot easier to control your paint and this wet edge, because you don't feel like you have to rush. And I stuck my hand in the paint over here. So I'm just going to go over this entire section real quick. And I can deal with this smudge when I'm all finished. I'm not sure what happened right here, but we're going to go over that again. And this is that area that was kind of damaged. I'm going to re-wet this. And I'm not being super precise because I'm only going to add color up at the top, and I'm going to go back in with this purple, a little bit more concentrated, and I'm going to drop that in. And I'm going to lift my paper here so I can help it run. Now it should only go where I've placed water, so it's not going to run into the mushroom. I can add a little bit of blue to this if I want. I'm going to make this edge just a little bit darker because I have that damage on the paper. And that is damage that I accidentally put with the eraser. I was trying to clean something up and I scrubbed a little bit too hard. It wasn't that the paper was damaged. So I don't want this hard edge along the mushroom, so I'm just gonna take my damp brush and run it along here and try to blend that in a little bit better. So I'm going to use my brush and lift out very carefully some of this extra paint where this is damaged, just so it's not so obvious. And I'm going to grab my smaller brush and wet it. I'm going to pick up some clear water and I'm going to drop in some water here and there. And I don't think, I know this area is still wet. Okay, so by dropping in that water, it will give the illusion of some glowing stars, and at the end we'll add in some white. So in the blog post I talk about working from large to small, and what I mean by that is we worked from our largest shapes and now we're at the point where we can start adding some details. We can look at our piece and ask ourselves, you know, what else we think it needs. We're already at that point. This is the kind of the fiddly part. This is the part I think a lot of people want to jump to when they first start painting, and you should always wait until you're satisfied at this stage with the way the painting looks. You want to build your form, you want to add the layers of paint that you need to add, and your shadows, you leave light areas. This is where we look at it and decide if we want to darken anything. And there are some things that I think I want to do. I want to add a little more texture into the stems, and I want to darken a few areas just so that it has a little bit more contrast. And I think after that we'll pull the masking fluid off of this cap and we'll add the yellow on top of those and some shading. And this is the fun part. This is the part where you get to step back and look at it and decide what else it needs. So I'm going to take a break and I'm going to let that dry, and we'll move on after all of this is dry. So everything's dry, and I'm going to take my, this is a rubber pickup. You can see it's well used, and you can use your finger I prefer this. It seems to pick up better than my finger does, so we'll use this to remove all of our masking fluid, and I have some paper that's lifting here, which is not good. But we're not going to put any, we're not going to put any paint in this area. So hopefully that won't be an issue. And I'm not quite sure why this is doing that. So I have a sanded eraser, and I am very lightly going to go over this, and hopefully it will pick up some of these pieces of paper. So painting is a lot of problem solving too, because we don't want to trash a painting just because something like this happens. And when I was in school and we were doing a project, like a finished assignment, and working on illustration board, and these were big pieces that required many hours. If we had a mess up with a pen, let's say, we would actually take an X-Acto knife, a craft knife, and very carefully peel away the first layer of paper to remove the mistake, because you don't, like I said, you don't want to spend hours on something and then throw it away just because something minor like this happens. And I think you just have to be very careful not to rub a hole into the paper. And I can clean this up very easily. I don't want to take any paint or water along the edge to clean this up, so what I'll do is grab a colored pencil to clean up the edges. And now we're gonna remove the masking from our mushroom, and hopefully we don't run into the same problem. Okay, this is pretty well cleaned off. I see a couple of spots here, and I don't know if I left the masking fluid on too long. I don't think I did. I'm just not a fan of what it does to the paper, or this is okay. This didn't damage the paper really too bad, but I think what I'm going to do is, since I'm breaking out the colored pencils for the moon to clean that up, I'm going to show you how you can use the colored pencils to add the shading in these white areas instead of using paint. So I have a couple of pencils here, and I'll be using this. These are polychromos, and this is called Delft Blue, and I am very lightly, I'm not going to put any pressure on this whatsoever. I'm just very lightly going to go in here and clean up the edge of this moon. Okay, I think that's pretty good. I also have this raw umber, and I have a ivory. So I'm going to lightly go over these white spots because they're not totally white. And I'll add the shadow in with the raw umber. And the spots that are on this side, I already know that these are a little more in shadow, so I can make these a little bit darker if I want. So I'm going to very lightly go over these to kind of push them back a little. And I'll leave the ones that are in the light, I'll leave those lighter. And I think I'm going to use a darker color to add the shadow. So I will pick up this is a sepia, a dark sepia, and I need to give this a quick sharpen. And very lightly just go along the bottom edge here. And I think while I have these colored pencils out, instead of getting the watercolor back out, I think I'm going to darken up a little bit of this. And I'm just very lightly kind of scumbling and going around in circles. And I'm using a light hand. I'm not applying a lot of pressure at all. And I want to add a little bit more of this dark down here to create some more contrast so that this stem is a little bit more noticeable. And we still need to add our white dots here. So I'll show you how I do that. I have a Posca pen. This is made by Uni, and this is a PC-1MR, and it's a 0.7, an ultra fine tip, and it's in white. And this is probably one of the best that I've found. And it has the same kind of tip that you have to prime, and you have to pump that to get the paint flowing. And I'm gonna start just adding in some areas here. And remember, when you're putting your dots on here, try not to be too uniform. And make some of them go off of the edge. Something like that. And I'm going to let that dry, and then I will take my watercolor and very lightly tint these so they're not super, super white. I am going to take this and I'm going to go back into my moon, and I'm going to redefine this edge along here. And let's see if we can get our point. That's a little bit better. And I want to clean up this other edge too. It looks a little bit fuzzy to me. And I'm going to add some highlights on some of these. Especially these towards the top. I'm going to do the same thing down here on the ones that we did with the watercolor. And I feel like we covered up some of these, so I'm going to add these back in. And if you find that some of your shapes are a little too uniform, this is a great way to go back in and make the shapes a little bit more irregular. So I'll take my same pen, and this is what we're going to use to add in the stars in the background. But first, before we do that, I think I want to go in with my colored pencil and add, actually no, my watercolor. I'm going to grab a small brush, and I'm going to make up a puddle of dark green. And I'm going to add in a few extra blades of grass. I don't want to overdo it. I'm going to rinse my brush off and wipe it off a little bit on the paper towel, and then I'm going to try and blend out this bottom edge of the grass that I just put in. And I think one little thing that I want to do before we add in the stars is grab some of this dark red. This is like a really cool red. And I'm just barely going to outline. I don't want to pull a straight line across, but I do want to add a little bit of just definition. So you can add this sort of like in a dashed or dotted line. And I'm going to do the same thing for these other two. And I'll rinse my brush out. And I'm going to grab my Posca pen and I'm going to start adding in the stars to the background. And I'm just going to do that by making large and small dots. I'm going to grab a fine tip gel pen that I have and see if I can get some finer dots, which I can. Now I know when you use cold press paper and you want to use a gel pen, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. The hot press is nice because it's smooth. Another way to do these stars is to use some ink, some white ink, and a toothbrush or a bristle brush, and you can splatter. I really don't want to do that because I don't want all of the white splatter on the mushroom. So I want to go ahead and add a little bit of a tint to the white dots that we made on that mushroom, and I'm just going to pick up what I have here on my palette. I have some yellow and some brown, and I'll grab a lot of water and just very lightly go over these dots. To push them back. So once these are dry, I can very lightly add in some of this shadow to these down here. These aren't that big, so they're not as obvious. A little bit goes a long way, though. Okay. Now we need to decide what we're going to do with this border. And I have more of these Posca pens. They have a little bit bigger of a tip. That's a possibility. Just do this in a different color. I think I'm going to stick with the brown. I think black would be a little bit too harsh. Okay, so I have this. This is a Pitt artist pen, and it's a brush pen. So the harder I push on this, the wider the line will be. And I think that's what I'm going to use for this border edge. And I'm going to start, I think, over here. And I'm going to move my whole arm, not just my wrist, because I'll get a better line. And this is an illustration. This isn't, you know, like I said, something super highly rendered. So it's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be. I did want to go out a little bit. And stop and I don't want to go all the way through because that's where our lettering will be. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do the lettering. I'm going to do it in this same brown. So I want to go from this, I think, like that. And maybe I can put a dot here and here and here. And the last thing that we want to do is we always want to sign our work. So that is our painting from start to finish. So we took this from an initial idea, and I really didn't have anything set up prior to starting this video, so this was completely impromptu on my part as far as coming up with an idea. I wanted you to see how this process actually works. So we sketched a rough idea, we did a couple of thumbnails to see where we wanted things. We tightened up our line drawing, we transferred it to our watercolor paper, and then I showed you how we painted from the large shapes and then added in layering to create form with our shadows, and at the very end we added our details. And this was a fun little exercise. I hope you liked it, and let me know if you did. Drop a comment below, and you can visit this particular blog post on my website, which is in the link in the description box below. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you again soon. Much love.